Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining the National Museum of the United States Army tonight for our monthly book talk. My name is Caitlin Healy, and I'm an educator at the museum. Tonight, we have Bob Drury and Tom Clavin speaking to us about their book, The Last Hill, the epic story of a Ranger battalion and the battle that defined World War II. Bob Drury is a 3-time National Magazine Award finalist, as well as a Pulitzer Prize nominee. He honed his investigative skills writing for all 4 New York City newspapers, as well as a variety of national publications. His journalism career has arced from sports to crime to adventure travel to foreign correspondence. He is also the author, co-author, or editor of 10 nonfiction books, including Blood and Treasure, Valley Forge, and Lucky 666. Tom Clavin is a #1 New York Times best-selling author and has worked as a newspaper editor, magazine writer, TV and radio commentator, and a reporter for the New York Times. He has also received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, and the National Newspaper Association. His books include the best-selling Frontier Lawman trilogy, which is composed of Wild Bill, Dodge City, and Tombstone, and Blood and Treasure with Bob Drury. Gentlemen, thank you again for joining us this evening. We at the museum have really been looking forward to this talk. Tom, I know you are starting us off, so I will let you take it from here.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the time that the National Museum of the United States Army is giving us. We're very pleased that Last Hill focuses on the United States Army and in particular Army Rangers. And before we get into the story itself and how we got that story, which really is something for Bob to discuss because he's the person that gets the credit for that, I want to talk a little bit about a little behind the scenes about the book, and it's a little bit maybe how the sausage is made. But once we started working on the book, we found that we had a remarkable challenge compared to where we were when we had done our first book together, which happened to be a World War II story, Halsey's Typhoon, which was published in 2007. Again, that was the very first book we did together. And very briefly, that was a story that took place with the United States Navy in December 1944. The fleet under Admiral William Halsey was racing towards the Philippines to assist in MacArthur's I Shall Return invasion of the Philippines. And it was struck by Typhoon Cobra. And many ships were damaged. 3 were actually sunk. And something like 900 men went into the water and about 80 survived. So basically the story was about the typhoon, but also the story was about the rescue of this one particular ship that stayed in the typhoon and rescued 55 of the 80 survivors. And I bring that up because when we were working on that book, of the 80 survivors, we were able to track down and interview, I'm going to say probably 24 of the men that were in the water.
Yeah.
And that was a great advantage to us because there's, as anybody in the audience who's a historian or has written narrative nonfiction about events that take place in the past, having those eyewitness accounts from an actual participant is of great advantage. So we interviewed about 24 men that had survived the catastrophe. And I should point out that just because somebody survived and we reached them doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get their story. Just a quick aside, there was one gentleman that we located, I think he was in Maryland, and we contacted him and said he'd been in the water for something like 60 hours before he was rescued. And we asked if we could interview him about his experience, and he hesitated and he said, "Let me call you back in 2 days." And he rang off, and we thought that was just getting rid of us. And we never expected to hear from him again, but lo and behold, 2 days later, he calls us up and he said, "I'm ready to be interviewed now." And we asked him if what took the 2 days, what was the hesitation about it? He said, "Well, if I'm going to tell you my story, I had to tell my wife of 58 years first." And we found that quite remarkable that this was somebody who had this tremendous ordeal and had not shared that with his family members. I should also point out that one of the people that were interviewed too was Gerald Ford, who was 91 at the time, and he also he committed a very heroic act, leading a fire brigade to save his aircraft carrier. I believe it was the USS Monterey, and this is something that Ford had not publicized. I mean, he could have used made a lot of political hay out of this all through his political career, but he really had only briefly mentioned it in an autobiography, which probably only he and his wife Betty read. But he was very forthcoming at the age of 91, and I think Bob was the one who spoke to him, and what a remarkable experience that had to have been to be talking to an ex-president, revealing a story that he had modestly kept to himself for decades.
Right.
So, so here we are. We're working on the book that became known as The Final Hill, and we realized that the difference that 15 years makes, from example, when we were working on Halsey's Typhoon to now, is not having these eyewitness accounts from the people who experienced them. Now, when you think about it, even the youngest World War II veteran alive today is in his 90s, mid 90s, really. I mean, do the math. If you were 17 years old, let's say in 1945, you're 90 something now. And so we found, okay, we have to come at it from a different way and do our research a different way. Now, there has been some things that have been written about the 2nd Ranger Battalion before. And one book that was helped to us was Douglas Brinkley's book, The Boys of Point du Hoc, because the 2nd Rangers had been known previously, if at all, for their heroics on D-Day. But what we had to track down were, several of our main characters no longer were living. People like Len Lomel, Bubby Stein, Elrod Petty, Doc Block, that's who he was known as Dr. Block, James Rudder, who was the head of the battalion. So we had to find several ways to get through that door. One was to find as many contemporaneous accounts as possible, and I think Bob will elaborate on that a little bit. Another way is that we did find that a few of the men later in life decided that they wanted, not for publication necessarily for the greater world, but for family and friends, especially for family and friends, what their experiences. So some of them sat down or did it as told to a friend or a business associate, and they would publish these memoirs privately published. Whether you're in favor of Amazon, one of the things that made possible is that some of these books can be made available through the Amazon, that otherwise these men would probably not have had the opportunity or the desire to write about their experiences. So there's that way to do it. Some of them were kind of published. Sometimes we could find interviews that were done over the years with even local newspapers. If somebody lived in New Jersey or Pennsylvania or in Idaho, they may have at some point, like especially in Veterans Day, they may have been approached by somebody when they were 87 years old and say, could you tell us what your experience was in World War II? So to try and dig through that. And so we found that we had to do things a different way. And one more thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Bob is that of great benefit has been the work of the institutions like museums of the U.S. Army, like the Army War College, especially the Museum of World War II down in New Orleans, who over the years have sought these World War II veterans and realized if we can do interviews with them or get them to give us compile oral histories of their experiences, these will live on a lot longer than they will. And that's what we found. We found with some of our main characters, we were fortunate that we could find transcripts, tapes that they had done, transcripts of their interviews, some of them lasting hours. If I remember, one of our characters, Herman, his nickname is Bubby, Bubby Stein, who was one of our main characters in the 2nd Rangers Battalion. He spoke for hours to an enthralled audience at the what was that? I think at that time the Eisenhower Center, and has since become morphed into the Museum of World War II. So contemporaneous accounts, the oral histories, the personal memoirs that are available, all gathered together gave us a better sense of what the 2nd Rangers were about. To tell us more about the 2nd Rangers themselves, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Drury.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks. And I also like to thank the National Museum of the United States Army for having us here tonight. And Caitlin, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, some of which was actually true. And to pick up, if I may, on what Tom was saying about the advantage of contemporaneous writings, digging into it to make this book go. Well, first of all, this does not mean we shirked the we took advantage of the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of official War Department at the time. It wasn't the Defense Department yet. War Department histories of World War II, the biographies, the autobiographies. I mean, some researchers for World War II have likened this to climbing a mountain. That's how much of a bulk there is. Luckily, we were limiting ourselves to this one Ranger battalion. And everything from World War II intelligence reports to after action reports. And in fact, that's basically how we started looking into this book. It turned out that, I guess what, several years ago, 3, 4 times, I was out having a beer with a friend of mine. I know it's hard to believe I was out having a beer. Tom Crowley, retired lieutenant colonel, artilleryman. And we were, so this is 3, 4 years ago. I forget what military disaster we were speaking about at the time. It was probably ISIS. And suddenly Crowley threw up his hands and he said, "Oh, it reminds me of the debacle of the World War II Battle of the Hurtgen Forest." And I was like, well, I should make an aside right now that being a salty ex-artilleryman, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Crowley did not use the word debacle. I think the phrase he used began with the word cluster, and I'll leave it to your imagination to imagine the second word. But anyway, when he said the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, I was like, wait, what? What? And Tom and I are fairly literate with military history. I mean, we've done 9 books together, and I had never heard of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. So it kind of stopped me cold. I called Tom that afternoon. I said, this is something maybe we should look into. Maybe there's a story here, and let's do some cursory research, see what's going on. So I pulled out that night. I came home and I pulled out my my official United States War Department history of the Siegfried Line campaign on the Belgian-German border in September, October, November of 1944. And yes, I am the kind of nerd that has that book on his home bookshelf. And the report, and a real door stopper, by the way. You could kill somebody if you hit him over the head with this report. It was written by, at the time, in 1963, by the United States Army's chief military historian, a man named Charles McDonald. And coincidentally, McDonald had fought through the Hurtgen Forest, and he had fought near our last hill as a 21-year-old infantry captain. And I wasn't certain what I would find. I started leafing through the pages, and man, were we rewarded. I called Tom. I said, man, we got everything. We got undaunted courage from American GIs. We had a personal sacrifice, a lot of blood and gore, a lot. And we're talking body parts strewn across the floor of the forest. American GIs fused together by direct artillery hits. This smell, and several people mentioned, not more than several, lots of people, the smell of gas gangrene just pervading this woodland from the gas escaping from the thousands of dead and dying soldiers. But so far, as I'm reading through, skimming through these pages, what it did not have a happy denouement. I mean, it was a good narrative, but I'm thinking to myself, where's the through line here? How do we end this book? Even the historian Charles McDonald more or less admitted that we were on the verge of it was a top-down catastrophe for the United States military. I mean, at one point, he was writing about one offensive that went over that took place over weeks, and as he described, I want to make sure I get his quote right. McDonald describes the effort: 1 man down for every 3 feet gained. Think about that. Take a step, 1 man down. Take another step, another man down. Take another step. And this went on for days and days and days. And McDonald pulled no punches. The historian McDonald pulled no punches. That this was, we were on our way to getting our butts kicked by the German Wehrmacht, who were finally desperately fighting for the Vaterland. They were not on French territory anymore. They were not on Dutch territory anymore. They were not on Belgian territory anymore. They were fighting for the fatherland, and Hitler actually had issued orders: you will fight to the last man and to the last cartridge. So, I mean, I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, exciting story, but there's a lot of individual American heroics. Take my word for it, but where's it going, and who's going to want to read a book about getting our butts kicked? But then, reading on in McDonald's official history, I came across a brief mention, almost as an aside, just a few paragraphs about this Ranger battalion. By this time in the war, it had been reduced to some 400 officers, non-coms, and enlisted men, and it was battered. It was just battered. It was maybe 2/3 of its original strength. And this Ranger battalion, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, which we write about, had proven itself during the Normandy landings, and it had proven itself during the post-invasion Brittany campaign. And suddenly, as a last resort, Dwight Eisenhower and his chief of staff and his entire staff are deploying this 400-man Ranger battalion into the Hurtgen Forest to try to turn the tide of this battle that regiments, thousands of men before them, had failed to do. So, I mean, you can imagine when I would, just those couple of paragraphs, bells were ringing. Choose your metaphor, antenna going up. So I called Tom and I said, you know, I think we got something here with these Rangers. So the next step, of course, was to answer the question, the famous question posed by Butch Cassidy to Sundance Kid: who are these guys? Who are these 400 Rangers who Eisenhower decides, I'm going to send them into the Hurtgen Forest, and they're going to succeed where thousands of American soldiers before them had not? So while Tom was exploring the papers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James L. Rudder, and Tom was finding all this great stuff. Rudder's communications officer, Ike Eichner. After the war, he became Lieutenant Ike Eichner, James Eichner, of course they nicknamed him Mike. He became this pack rat, collecting all these papers, 6 linear feet, which when he died, he willed to the Army War College in Pennsylvania. And Tom mentioned the 2nd Battalion's chief surgeon, Walter E. Block, Doc Block, of course they called him. Tom found Doc Block's youngest son, 72-year-old Jeffrey Block, outside of Chicago. And Jeffrey says to Tom, oh, by the way, I have my father's combat diary, handwritten. I can Xerox it and send it to you. And we're like, yeah, please do. Please do. We discovered stacks, Tom mentioned stacks of interviews stored in different museums by these Rangers. And this is what makes, I think, makes a Drury Clavin book, are these contemporaneous writings. So one day I'm talking to a friend of mine, and he says, well, do you know about this retired Army Colonel Paul Zygo? I said, no, I don't. Well, he lives and this friend of mine was at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he said, where do you live? And I told him the town I live in on the Jersey Shore. And he said, Paul Zygo lives in the next town. I said, okay. And this means, he goes, well, there's one man in that 2nd Battalion twice was considered worthy of the Medal of Honor, which is, of course, our nation's highest military award. Len Lamel was his name. Now, Len died in 2011 at the age of 91, but Paul Zygo was still alive. And Paul Zygo considered himself an amateur historian, and he was leading a campaign to have Len Lamel awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor for his actions upon our last hill, which is Hill 400 on the eastern edge of the Hurtgen Forest, Hill 400 in meters, so it's 1,300 feet. And what Len Lamel did up there, and I said, well, I got to find Paul Zygo. And of course, I went over and I tracked him down, and I said, can we have coffee? And we met in a coffee shop. And when he walked into the coffee shop with this giant briefcase, and he started taking out stacks of paper this thick, I said, we've hit the mother lode. I know we've got it now. So sure enough, Colonel Zygo had not only, retired Colonel Zygo, he had not only collected letters from Len Lamel's battalion mates. But in their letters attesting to Lammel's heroics, not only on Hill 400, but at Normandy Beach, they of course included what their situation was. So here, once again, contemporaneous writing, stuff you're not going to find in official after action reports, all kinds of personal recollections, from stateside training to rehearsing, climbing. Half the Ranger Battalion landed at Omaha Beach. The other half had to climb the cliffs of Pontotoc on Normandy Beach. So they're training in England, Southwest England, climbing cliffs, to the invasion itself, to the Brittany campaign that I think Tom mentioned. I mean, I was giddy. I got home from that coffee line. I must have spent 4 hours with Paul Zygo in that coffee shop. And I got home and I called Tom. I said, I think we got a book here. I think there's stuff here. The personal recollections gleaned from these contemporaneous writings. I know I'm repeating myself, but if there was a narrative bone in the historian Charles MacDonald's, if there was a narrative bone, we were now getting the meat to hang on that bone. I mean, Lammel himself, forget about Zygo trying to get him the Medal of Honor, for his actions on Hill 400. At Normandy, at Pontotoc, his fearlessness, his quick thinking basically saved the entire D-Day invasion. I mean, and when his superiors wanted to put him in for the Medal of Honor for his actions on Normandy Beach, Lammel, we were finding from letters to Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, no, don't do it. Please don't do it. Lammel was aware that the War Department at the time had a policy that any Medal of Honor recipient was immediately pulled from combat. We couldn't have a Medal of Honor recipient killed in combat. Worse, we could not have a Medal of Honor recipient captured by the enemy and paraded about. So he said, don't do it. Please don't do it. So instead, he was given a field promotion to second lieutenant and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is our nation's second highest military award. And we're finding from these letters, from these diaries, from these journals. I mean, the Ranger captain, Harold the Duke Slater, I love the Duke, even his nickname swaggered. We're finding out that when his landing craft was sunk, he was blown off his landing craft a mile from Normandy Beach, floated for hours in the frigid English Channel, was finally scooped up and was about to be taken to a medical ship. He pulled his sidearm and said, no, you're taking me to my company on the beach. We're finding, Tom mentioned Bubby Stein, one of my favorite characters in the book. Bubby Stein, I mean, Herman Bubby, of course, a New York City kid. Now, when he was scampering up the cliffs of Pontotoc, his life preserver, his Mae West life preserver, inflated, and he got stuck on the rope ladder. And the Germans are firing down bullets, hand grenades, machine guns, and people are yelling, Bubby, you gotta move, you gotta move. Now he finally got disentangled, but it turns out Bubby was the best climber, a New York City kid, the best climber in the battalion. And we learned from several letters that there were a few Rangers who thought that Bubby might have been a second story man for the Jewish mob in New York City before the war. I mean, and then one of my favorite characters, Staff Sergeant Elrod Petty. Now, Elrod, he was a good old boy from South Georgia, red clay territory, Loblolly Pines. And Elrod, he had had a rough childhood. His father had beaten him. He was a street fighter. He had even played a year of football at the University of Georgia before dropping out and enlisting in the U.S. Army. And when he volunteered for the Rangers, as one of his superiors said, Elrod Petty became the heart and soul of Fox Company. But he almost did not make it. And that was because of his upbringing, Elrod Petty had no front teeth top and no front teeth bottom. And Lieutenant Colonel Rudder just did not, he couldn't get it. He didn't like the cut of his jib. A man with no teeth just did not strike Lieutenant Colonel Rudder as the type of man he wanted as a U.S. Army Ranger. And even though Elrod Petty's immediate commanders would go to Rudder and say, you can't transfer him out. He's our best BAR man, Browning automatic rifle. He is the heart and soul of Fox Company. Finally, one day, Rudder saw him and he called him into his office and he was about to transfer him out. And Elrod Petty pled his case, and he said, I had a bad upbringing. I have no family. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, they become my family. But what really convinced Rudder not to transfer Elrod Petty out was at the end of his plea, his speech, he looked at him and said, plus, Colonel, I ain't planning on biting no Nazis to death. And that's what made Rudder decide to keep him in the battalion. So at this point, Tom and I knew we had a book. And we knew we would follow this 2nd Ranger Battalion from their dusty outpost where they were stood up in Tennessee, across the Atlantic to their training in England, and then across the English Channel to the invasion of Normandy Beach. Right, Tom?
Yeah, one of the things that I am an old movie buff, and one of the things that appealed to me as Bob explained more to me of what he was discovering about the 2nd Ranger Battalion and starting to think about the arc of the story is I think the story to me resembled in a lot of ways some of those old Warner Brothers movies that were made during the World War II, where you had people in the supporting cast were people like Alan Hale and George Tobias and Frank McHugh and some of these other characters who we know, Richard Jekyll, and then you had this ragtag.
Von Richard Jekyll, right?
Yeah,
I remember him. Yeah.
Yeah, he was in every war movie, and Richard Carlson, and you had sort of like this ragtag group in training camp until a tough older lieutenant, captain, major, take your pick, came in and made a unit out of them. They may have hated him at first, but he was going to make them into a fighting force, and that was going to go overseas and make a difference. And that's sort of what the story of the 2nd Ranger Battalion is. It was based in Tennessee in a training camp. One commander after another was basically failed to turn them into a unit. And along came James Earl Rudder, a high school football coach, and he was a tough guy but fair. He weeded out a lot of the riffraff from the unit. Kept thankfully people like Elrod Petty, even without his teeth, and trained them into an elite unit, one of the really a special force. We sort of take these terms special forces for granted today because there's several of them, but there are only a handful of them back in 1940, 41, 42. And so the 2nd Ranger Battalion became a special force, obviously following the footsteps of Darby's Rangers, the 1st Ranger Battalion. And they went overseas. They were based in England. There was D-Day, the guns at Pointe du Hoc. So that story we have in our book, but the next phase was how do we get from there to the last hill, which is obviously the title piece of action in our story. And that's where during the Brittany campaign, one of our favorite characters comes in, Bob Edlin, man from Indiana, who became known as the Full Lieutenant because he was seemingly fearless. There was no assignment he wouldn't take on, official or not. And Bob came up with this group. He and 3 other men became like the Fabulous Four, not the Fantastic Four of Marvel Comics fame, but they would go on these ad hoc reconnaissance missions. Now, Colonel Rudder sort of knew they were doing it, but he turned a blind eye. He couldn't officially sanction them, but he didn't want to stop them because they were coming back with some good intelligence. They would keep going farther and farther out. And one story that's in the book, which I think people who have read the book and have commented to us, is one of their favorite stories in the book, is that there's a fortress there that has something like 800 Germans in it, and the Ranger Battalion and other Allied forces are getting prepared to attack it. They expect a large loss of life. Can they take it at all? They're going to have to soften it up with artillery, et cetera, et cetera. But so one night, Bob Edlin takes his 3 guys, and he says, well, why don't we go check the place out? Let's just like sneak up there, see if anybody's home. And that's what they do. They sort of sneak their way through, even past a minefield, and get to the fortress, and basically leaving one guy behind who might have to run back and tell the colonel what's going on. They essentially knock on the door. And when a German officer answers, they put a gun on him and say, take us to your commandant. And this fortress has several levels to it. So from one level to another, they go upstairs. They finally get to the office of Colonel Furst, F-U-R-S-T. And they burst in and they say, okay, we're the first contingent of you're surrounded by Rangers. You better surrender. And Colonel First says, let me make a phone call. He makes a phone call, and he nods, and he gets off the phone. He says, well, actually, there's only 4 of you, and there's 800 of us. So I think maybe you should surrender. And Edlin says he doesn't like that idea very much. So he asks one of his colleagues there for a hand grenade, which he takes the pin out, and he shoves it into the colonel's, as we call it, nutsack. And he said that you have 5 seconds to surrender, or this thing goes off. And the colonel is incredulous at first, but 1, 2, 3, 4, I surrender. We surrender. And lo and behold, he gets on the loudspeaker and he tells his men to go out in the courtyard and lay down their weapons. And as Edlin and the others are looking down into the courtyard, sure enough, hundreds of Germans evacuate the fortress to the courtyard, line up, put down their weapons, and Edlin basically can go back to Colonel Rudder and say, "Well, we've taken the fortress, so come look and see." So there's sort of like a footnote to that story that I won't get into because it's a funny footnote about the actual official surrender scene. I want to push forward to the Hürtgen Forest, which Bob talked about in some detail about how atrocious a setting it was for the entire Allied forces who were in there. And the last hill we're talking about, which is also known as Castle Hill, basically was both a strategic and psychological target. Psychologically, it was just inside Germany. If this hill fell, it basically, in a sense, it opened a door to Germany. As Bob mentioned earlier in our talk, they weren't fighting in Belgium anymore. They weren't fighting in Holland. They would be fighting on German soil. And as a psychological blow, that would be to a lot of the German officers and soldiers to have this kind of intrusion onto the fatherland. Strategically, it was important because the Germans were using it as an observation post to direct artillery strikes on the Allied forces. And in turn, maybe even more important, from the top of the hill, if you look back into Germany, you could see the Ardennes forest, the massing of equipment and tanks and motorized vehicles and soldiers and everything else going on. That would become the great offensive that Hitler was planning that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. So presumably, if you took that hill, you'd be able to sniff out what was going on over there before it was too late to, and then the attack began. So as Bob mentioned, regiments had tried it. Finally, they brought the 2nd Ranger Battalion in there, which had become the Allied SWAT team, so to speak. And their orders were to take that hill. And that's on the morning, I think it was December 7th, 1944. They lined up, the artillery started. And
actually, it was December 6th.
December 6th. And then they get lined up, they got ready to go. And I'll leave it up to Bob to describe. There was a particular motivational cry that was given to the Rangers that got them to get up from where they were and start going up that hill.
Well, I will add one thing to the Fu lieutenant story when he took the Locris battery, it was called, at the Brittany. As Tom, and once again, contemporaneous writings, because Tom found these 2 elderly sisters in Minnesota who had taken down Bob Edlin, the Fu lieutenant's story, and he didn't pull any punches. He shoved that grenade into Colonel First, officious paratrooper. He shoved it right into his nutsack. But there had been a war correspondent for the Times traveling, the New York Times, traveling with the 2nd Ranger Battalion at the time. And the way he wrote it was, he shoved the grenade into the colonel's midsection. So I understand that were the mores of newspaper journalism at the time. But if we didn't have Bob Edlin giving his story to these 2 sisters, we wouldn't have known that grenade actually went a little bit lower. But I'm well aware that the 4 most important words in any public speaker's vocabulary are, and so in conclusion. So I'll leave you with this. I'll try to paint you a word picture of, as Tom mentioned, on the morning of December 6th, 1944, as the bulk of what was left of the 2nd Ranger Battalion spread out along the Hürtgen Forest floor to provide covering fire, 130 Rangers massed to ascend and take this hill, Hill 400, the last hill of our book title. One ranger described it as trying to climb a 1,300-foot children's playground slide, slippery, slick with snow and sleet, frozen mud, while German infantry were pouring bullets and machine gunners were pouring bullets and mashed potatoes, though German hand grenade down the slopes. By the time the ranger contingent reached the top of that hill, 100 were still standing. And then that was followed by vicious hand-to-hand fighting. Neither side had time to reload their BARs, their rifles, their carbines. So they fought with sidearms. They fought with their bayonets. They fought with their entrenching tools. They fought with their helmets. And they finally drove the Germans off. And they established a small perimeter, which was a feat quite in itself because the Germans immediately counterattacked. And then they counterattacked again. And then they counterattacked again. They counterattacked 5 times that day. And in between, incessant shelling, German shelling on the ranges atop Hill 400. So by that night, those 100 Rangers who had made it to the top of Hill 400 were down to 50. The Germans shelled them all night. By the morning, they took a head count. They were down to between 30 and 40 Rangers. 2 more counterattacks. The shelling would stop and the counterattacks would begin. The Rangers would drive the Germans back, and then the shelling would begin again. So after 36 hours on this Hill 400, the last hill, the only surviving officer, American officer atop the hill, Lieutenant Len Lamel, took a head count. There were 22 Rangers still effective. And by effective, it means they could hold a weapon. They were all wounded. Lamel himself, his left hand was mangled. He had taken shrapnel from a shell. He was bleeding from his nose, from his mouth. No one knew it, but he was also bleeding from his anus from the shell's concussive vibrations. And Lamel counted these 22, and he called the only 4 non-commissioned officers still standing. He called them into a circle, and he pointed down the eastern slope of the hill where they could see that the Wehrmacht, the infantry, were not only massing for yet another counterattack, but they were being reinforced by this elite unit of Jager German paratroopers. You see, the Hitler had promised any unit, Iron Crosses first class to every man in any unit who could take back Hill 400. So these 22 Americans are looking down the hill. They know what's coming. And Lamel says to these 4 sergeants, I understand the United States Army is not a democracy. But in this case, and only in this case, I'm going to make an exception. The 5 of us are going to take a vote. We are going to vote whether to retreat back down the west side of the hill, gather the rest of our Ranger Battalion, and retake this hill, which I know we can, or we're going to vote whether we are going to stand and fight with the 22 men we have. And by this time, among those 22 men were people who were crawling out, American Rangers who were crawling out of the makeshift aid station with their rifles, preferring to die in the line. So Len Lamel, Lieutenant Len Lamel, and his staff sergeant, a master sergeant, and 2 sergeants, they took that vote. And well, if you want to know how that vote came out, you're going to have to read the damn book. Thank you very much for having us here tonight. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Gentlemen,
Please direct the hard ones to Tom and the easy ones to me.
Gentlemen, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions. Actually, it's really interesting. Our producer, Jen, and I were kind of chatting while you were talking, and we believe that you were the first dual authors of a book ever on our program. So that really, and we did have a question in the Q&A. What's your process of doing this research? You kind of talked about how you found the 2nd Battalion. Once you chose the topic, what's your process to write? How do you kind of divvy that up between the both of you?
Well, Tom writes one sentence and I write the next. No, that's not, of course not. We have a pretty good Henry Ford, although he was an evil man. We have a pretty good kind of Henry Ford like assembly line going, whereas we both will, as I hope we put across, we'll dive into the research. But Tom's the kind of guy, you could throw me into the Library of Congress, into the National Archives, and I might find what I'm looking for, but you might have to come in with like those miner's hats with the lights on them to come in and find me. Tom is so good at that stuff. Back in the day when he mentioned Halsey's Typhoon, when we were interviewing survivors, we would kind of split them up. But now we do the research together, but Tom is a stronger researcher than I am. And you can only have one voice. So I do the writing. And what we do is, like I said, we have an assembly line going. I'll write a chunk and I'll send it back to Tom, who is also a wonderful editor. And I'll have questions or he'll have questions. And so we kind of have this hamster wheel going until the book is actually done. I don't know, did I describe that right, Tom, or not? You got anything to add?
No, it is. We've described ourselves before as a double play combination. And, we sort of complement each other. And lo and behold, 2 years later, hey, we have a book.
So we think.
Yeah, we think so anyway. Hopefully the public thinks so too.
Right.
A question from an audience member: what motivated these men to fight so hard against such odds? Was it their ranger training, or was it something else?
I think if I could answer that, I think what we got from our research and writing about the 2nd Ranger Battalion is that they knew that they were an elite group of soldiers. They had trained very hard. I think there was an enormous pride in being an Army Ranger. And remember, an Army Ranger was a new concept, a new a new designation back in 1940.
A new old concept from Rogers.
Yeah, right, Rogers Rangers. But as far as the so-called modern American military in 1941, 42, and 43, to be an Army Ranger was to have been, for the most part, you had to go through a lot of rigorous training to be selected. You could wash out at any moment. You had to be the best of the best. So I think that they had to, they felt a sense of always keep proving that they were the best of the best and taking great pride. They had to outperform I use this word, gently, a normal soldier. A normal soldier is a wonderful soldier too. But if you're an Army Ranger, you have to be twice or 3 times or 4 times the man that a normal soldier is. And when push comes to shove, as it did on the last hill, this is where they showed themselves.
You mentioned by the end of the battle that there are only 22 men who were able to still hold a weapon. Has there been any movement to award these men, this battalion, with the Medal of Honor or any other sort of military accolade?
Oddly enough, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions on Normandy Beach. And then they were put in for a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions at Top Hill 400. And nothing ever came of it. And the Ranger Society, what's the Ranger Society name, Tom? I can't remember you get my point. I can't remember the official name. It's called the Ranger Society. Several of the Rangers who have participated in the Battle of the Hurricane Forest and for Hill 400, they found out 3 or 4 years later that the potential award was just buried in papers in the War Department. And they were the kind of guys, I suppose they could have pursued it if they wanted to. And it's like Colonel Paul Zygo trying to pursue the Medal of Honor for Len Lamel. I'm surprised nobody has taken up that cause. I don't know, maybe our book, The Last Hill, will have some people rethinking.
It's really interesting. Why don't you think their story is more well known?
I don't know, Tom.
That's a good question. I think one reason I think it's not like the Second Ranger Battalion has never been written about before. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned the book, the Boys of Point du Hoc by Douglas Brinkley. I think it's because there was attention given to their heroics on D-Day itself, that it's almost like the Second Ranger Battalion after D-Day, went back to the United States and was never heard from again, which is certainly not true. I think it's that reason that there was never been, to our knowledge, adequate follow-up on the rest of their activities in France in the summer and the fall of 1944. I think the other thing that happened too is that immediately after the actions of Hill 400, that first week in December, within days really of the Hill 400 battle concluding, the Battle of the Bulge began, and that became one of the most certainly celebrated actions of World War II. I mean, the movies are made about it. There's all kinds of reams and reams of pages have been spent on books and articles about the Battle of the Bulge. So I think what happened with the Rangers at Hill 400 tended to get obscured, and that was one of the exciting things for us to find out that there's a lot of that there really was a story that for the most part has gone untold for decades.
And if I could add to that, I will say that the Ike Eichner, the comms officer who left the 6 linear feet of papers to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, he was quoted as saying, "We were always the runt of the litter. We were 400 or 500 men. So we were attached to regiments. We were attached to battalions. We were always attached to somebody. And when we he didn't put it in a bragging way, but when we succeeded, the regiment got the credit. The battalion got the credit. The Second Ranger Battalion was just part of the bigger picture. And I think that's why, we were lucky to discover and dig out these guys. And I mean, Tom and I are always we tend to write books about ordinary men who rise to extraordinary circumstances in combat. And you can't get much more ordinary men like Elrod Petty and Bubby Stein and Len Lamell and Ike Eichner, who rose to extraordinary circumstances during World War II.
Wonderful. Another question from the audience. Were you able to visit Hill 400 either during your research period or when you were writing the book? And if so, how did it feel to be there?
Here's the deal. I am unlike Tom's been on the road, but I'm the road guy. And I have gone on the road for Blood and Treasure. I followed Daniel Boone's tracks from Pennsylvania down to the Blue Ridge, across the Hill and Valley, or the Ridge and Valley section of the Appalachians, through the Cumberland Gap, up and through Kentucky, for our book on Red Cloud, the heart of everything that is. I spent 6 weeks out in the Montanas, the Dakotas, Wyoming. COVID hit as we were writing this book. I had actually paid a guide to meet me at the Hurtgen Forest. I couldn't get in. I couldn't get into Belgium. I couldn't get into Germany. They wouldn't let me in. So I lost my down payment, by the way. But what I did do, the guide I had paid, I said, you have to find someone who runs a drone service. Drones are ubiquitous these days. And I hooked up with that guy and I paid him to fly a drone. I would direct him where I wanted to go. I wanted to go to this village. I wanted to go to this village where the Rangers got massacred. I wanted to go there. Now fly over Hill 400, go up the west slope, go down the east slope, go around. So no, for that, this is the one book where I actually did not have boots on the ground researching. So because of COVID, I did the next best thing. I took all the video from the drone and I tried to put it together as best I could.
Yeah, COVID held that hill that the Germans couldn't.
Yeah, right.
Well, now you know where to go on your next vacation. Another question from the audience. During the interview process with these men, how did they view their legacy or their accomplishments decades afterwards?
Well, I think as we were watching we had transcripts and we also could watch, you could find on YouTube, for example, Bubby Stein, some of the other men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. You could actually watch their interviews. And I think that they were obviously proud of their actions, but I was struck by how modest they were, how self-effacing. It really was a band of brothers kind of thing. They were there was a real caring about each other and sharing the credit. And so I think that I never got the impression that when I was watching any of these things that there was any boasting going on. I think there's also a feeling of they were very, very grateful to have survived, because all of these men who survived lost very, very dear friends. They were two brothers who were killed within minutes of each other. The Anderson brothers on Hill 400. So they might not have literally lost brothers, the others of them, but they had become brothers by this point. You're talking about a Ranger battalion of only undersized battalion of only 400 men. They all knew each other quite well. They served each other. So they think when they were doing their interviews, I think they were more concerned about making sure that credit went to their brothers, to their fellow Rangers, rather than any one of them saying, I'm a hero.
Once again, Caitlin, ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances in combat and then returning to being ordinary men.
Absolutely. We are quickly running out of time, so this is going to be the last question of the evening. But people in the audience are big fans of yours, really dug Blood and Treasure. What is next for the dynamic duo?
Oh boy, Bob, I'm glad she asked that question.
Well, let me put it this way. I've just booked, I'm not even sure how it's going to be. I have an open-ended flight back, but I am going out west and I'm following the Missouri River up through Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, turning left at the Big Bend into Montana, down through the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming, because we are exploring Jedediah Smith and the Mountain Men.
Thank you again to Bob and Tom for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
Thank you.
Fabulous presentation, really great book. Really hope that everyone in the audience gets a chance to read it. We hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and we look forward to seeing you again at future programs. Again, Bob, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everyone. Good night.